Shalom and welcome to Powers in Play, our monthly program dealing with global and not only regional issues. And usually we are concentrating on the wars of the day, the existential but immediate crisis. The American military has a term, or used to have one when they were preparing for World War III, operations other than war. And today we are going to deal with crisis under the war, but with existential implications for the long run. That is what is happening with the Russia against Ukraine war as regards the food security problem, climate, that is the planet and what is going to happen to it with all the floods and wildfires and hurricanes, and other such issues, energy, security, and the like. And our guests here on my left, two retired or reserve Air Force officers, one flying and one trying to shoot him down.
Not trying, we access. I mean, we are doing it.
Colonel,
we succeed, I'm saying.
Colonel Reuven Ben Shalom, a cross-cultural strategist. Welcome. Brigadier General Doron Gavish, thank you for coming. And on the other side, as befits the national security staff, the military versus the diplomats, former ambassador to Washington and former deputy foreign minister, Ambassador Dani Ayalon, welcome.
Thank you.
And Eran Etzion, formerly with the foreign ministry and a former deputy head of the national security staff.
Hi.
Welcome to all of you. Let's start with you, Eran. Recently, we have learned that what is happening in the Black Sea or the Danube ports leading to Moldova and other Balkan countries regarding the grain agreement is having quite dire consequences for the rest of Europe and perhaps even more than that. Now, we all know that the Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of Europe. If this was not a tragedy, but rather a musical, one could have said that the drain of grain is quite severe in Ukraine. How can the world contend with such a problem when the most basic staple is at risk?
Well, the whole Ukrainian-Russian war is a strategic surprise for everyone involved. Yes, in the months leading to the crisis, there were indications that both the British and the American intelligence shared with the public in a very interesting way. But this was pretty late in the game, and no one was really prepared for it. The Europeans, as we know, most of them hoped/assessed that eventually it's not going to happen, that Putin will back down. So in virtually every aspect, from the most basic armaments to combat tactics to wide-ranging implications on their own populations, on their own national security, on the overall security of Europe, everything was, and to a certain extent still is, in flux. And that includes the more kind of remote ramifications that you spoke about. So it's not a surprise that under these conditions, we find ourselves in this kind of crisis. And unfortunately, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to food security, there are usually no quick fixes. The real remedy for the problem has to do with long-term planning, with finding alternative sources, with cultivating alternative breeds, and so on and so forth, things that, again, nobody really was prepared for, and they're now trying to, but again, unfortunately, there's no kind of a humanly possible way to fix it at the appropriate time. So there's going to be suffering. There is suffering. There's going to be more and more suffering emanating from that respect and from the other respects of this global crisis. And I don't have any, quick fixes or creative ideas in terms of how to do it better than they're scrambling to do right now.
But when you were with the national security staff, usually you dealt with military intelligence, diplomacy. Did you ever have or led a discussion regarding self-sufficiency or other ways to deal with a crisis in which imports would be near impossible? Usually Israel's wars were very quick, a week or so. In the Yom Kippur War, 3 weeks were considered very long, but planes are flying, ships are arriving. Aren't we too complacent when we are deserting our old notions of self-sufficiency, of growing our needs at home?
It's a very interesting point that needs a lot of elaboration that we can't do in this kind of setting, but I can tell you you'd be very surprised, but we did deal with it when I was in the National Security Council. It was in the early days, around 2000, 2001, the early days of the National Security Council as such, and we kind of scoped around and tried to find issues that are both important and are neglected, not dealt with by other organizations in the system. And we found this issue of self-sufficiency and food security, and even the intricate relations between environmental issues and national security, which at the time absolutely nobody was dealing with. And we did try to look into self-sufficiency and strategic reserves beyond oil, because the only thing that, at least at the time, and I suspect that's still the case, the only national reservoir that existed at the time was an oil reservoir. There was no other strategic reservoir of any kind, let alone food or wheat or anything like that. And we did look into what would it mean for Israel to be, shall we say, more self-reliant or self-sufficient. To cut to the bottom line, we found, at least at the time, that there is no real possibility for Israel to be self-sufficient. Agriculture-wise, we're too small. There are other challenges relating to seasons and climate and so on that make it virtually impossible. But we did set certain targets for us to be more self-sufficient in certain critical areas.
It's very interesting that when the first pioneers came to Israel more than 100 years ago, one of their ideals was to cultivate the land and go back to farming. And then gradually, even kibbutzim, collectives usually founded on such ideals, went to industry.
To industry, yes.
So, Danny, you were both at the Foreign Ministry, in the Prime Minister's office, then Ambassador to Washington and Deputy Foreign Minister. When you were in one of those capacities, or especially in Washington, you must have dealt with what is called prepositioning. It is public knowledge that the U.S. military has some storage sites in Israel for munitions, both for American use, as we have seen in the Ukraine war, when they had to draw down on their own stocks. They took advantage of these facilities, and for Israel, rather than have an airlift during war. Was there any idea of having a similar prepositioned storage for canned goods or any other sort of necessities, of staples? Because during war, merchant marine could also come under attack by submarines or other sort of what hostile navies have. And this would have freed the Israeli Navy to concentrate on military and naval targets and let Israel take care of its population by drawing from these stocks?
Well, I must say that I cannot recall any discussion other than the prepositioning of armaments. And one more thing was a guarantee, American guarantee to supply Israel with oil in case of some oil.
Cooking oil or just petroleum?
Petroleum, and this was actually part of the appendixes of the Camp David Accord with Egypt. Once Israel withdrew from the Sinai and also left behind the oil wells, the Americans
in the Gulf of Suez.
Yes, exactly. The Americans guaranteed that in case of need, they will guarantee a free flow, constant and automatic flow of petroleum to Israel. So other than that, I do not recall dealing with anything else. And quite frankly, I think that over there, with this coming of globalization, the global village, this very famous Hillary Clinton book, the thing was, end of history, with the fall of the Soviet Union.
No, what Hillary Clinton wrote was, it takes a village.
It takes a village, exactly.
An entire village to raise a child.
Right. But at that time, people thought, here, we are coming into this kumbaya where, peace is the, bedrock for great sustainability and development, economic development.
No, it was a very famous line, the wolf lying down with sheep, only a new sheep every day.
Exactly, right. But here I must say that, if you go back to the very basics of economics, as a discipline, from Adam Smith on, the principle always was of specialization and comparative advantage. If one country has a comparative advantage in producing cups, and another country has a comparative advantage in producing forks, it makes sense that they would trade cups for forks.
What's Israel's?
Well, Israel is pretty much armaments, and especially after the tension that came out of the
Israel
Ukrainian
can
war.
export Jews.
Also, absolutely.
And news.
And news.
And news, right. But the whole idea was, this specialized, drilling down to specialization and comparative advantage, it went hand in hand with globalization. Nobody thought at the time that we would have geopolitical crisis like Taiwan, China, the Ukraine, which actually upsets the entire model.
Reuven, you have waited patiently for your turn, so you're going to be rewarded with a very easy question.
With this tough topic, I wanted to hear the smart people first.
Is it militarily advantageous, and is it part of just war to starve populations?
This, of course, touches on a moral issue.
Ethics.
37 years in the IDF, I never heard any such concept of trying to inflict massive harm to populations like that. I wouldn't even bring it up as a possibility for our kind of country. I do want to say that the military is a tiny component of national security. We think, we spent most of our career doing it, but what was it? It's a small piece of the overall picture. And it's mostly, especially in Israel, it's perceived as something much larger, right? It's our very existence and promoting our national goals. Yet what it is, it's the capability of the government to implement its policy in a certain way.
Clouds.
Also, I believe that we tend to tell ourselves stories. And sometimes those stories are not exactly true, and not only us. There's a big debate, even if the invasion of Iraq by the United States was for weapons of mass destruction that only then they found out was a mistake, or was that resources, right? Were all the wars in the last few decades all about resources?
But conspiracy theories aside.
No, not conspiracy theories, because nations have interests and we try to promote our interests. As we speak, what is China doing? China is promoting their long-term national interests and working very hard to grasp the resources around the world, right, to fuel their economy because they want to be in the lead. So I think this is the way we need to see it. Also, the issue of globalization. I think in a way it's not the issue we talked about Hillary Clinton's book. It's not that we thought we'll have peace on earth and, oh no, we're still back at, humanity didn't change. Our natural state did not change. And even though technology was leading to globalization and the internet and all these issues did mean globalization, I think now in the last decade we understand that in a way it's going to be reversed. because wars like in Russia and what's going on, even the breakthroughs in technology mean that everything changed. It used to be about oil, right? So you had a motor that you put oil in it, or gas in it, and it worked. And now you have batteries, and batteries need minerals, and minerals are mined in different places. The whole world changed. And by the way, those specific minerals are in very few countries that dominate most of the world. So all our efforts shifted. So I think we're, in a way, counter-globalization now, self-sufficiency. And one more comment about grains. We do have silos. Of course, Israel has silos full of grains. I don't know if it's for a week or for 2 months, but certainly we have people that deal with that. Yet we've all been there, and we mostly like to deal with the bad guys. What are the Iranians trying to do now? And the military and clashes. Not enough of us are dealing with the more important things of talking about long-term resource and self-sufficiency and R&D that will help to counter that.
This is what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah. So humanity in general is not in the right track, for sure.
But your expertise is in cross-cultural analysis. Are there certain societies, certain cultures, where even the threat of, let's say, starvation or thirst could bring them to either tell you that the fight is over, to surrender, or conversely, make them fight even more ferociously because they fear extinction? And this is part of psychological warfare too.
Okay, this is only my personal opinion on this matter, because every expert on cross-cultural issues will say something else. I believe that human beings are mostly the same. There are many differences in the way we perceive the world. Many times, by the way, it's the way we express ourselves, even though inside we're the same. So I think that mostly in these issues, the countries want to do good for their people. They look after themselves. I think in rhetoric, you will see huge differences. And by the way, even in the United States, that I love very much, over the decades, you see how the rhetoric changes, right? From talking about U.S. interests, we're promoting our own interests, to talking about collaboration and values and harmony and all that. Yet, human nature didn't change and U.S. interests didn't change. But they learn how to change in a way the rhetoric, because in this day and age, you need collaboration, you need coalitions, or else you can't succeed in promoting your own goals. Looking at China, looking at Asia, certainly there you have a unique culture where it's much more difficult to drill down and understand the real interest, which is why it's hard for us to understand China and what they're doing. We could easily argue, what are they trying to achieve? The same thing.
But regarding Arab cultures, Arab populations,
even here, I would argue we like to perceive ourselves as so different from the Arabs, right? Especially in the existential clash we're in, and terrorism and all that. Certainly in our minds, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, their interests are different. No, their interests are the same. And many of these nations have national pride, they have resilience, they have long-term goals, and going to your question, they're willing to sacrifice and suffer in order to promote these goals. By the way, if we weren't like that, why would we even be here? I'd probably be back in the United States, or we could move to New Zealand, right? So
if they take us.
Our rivals are the same. It's easy, by the way, to take Lebanon and Iran as we speak and say, what are you doing? Nobody wants anything from you. There's no territorial dispute. Your economy is in shambles. Let's get our act together and do good in the Middle East. What's the problem? Human nature, the same.
General Gavish, you're a high-ranking Air Force officer, and most specifically air defense, but you're also part of the military elite, the top brass, and you're a graduate of the National Security College. So you're obviously well-versed in other issues, not only the Iron Dome and such systems. Usually in the Israeli military, as far as the public knows, one of the doctrinal debates has to do with fire versus maneuver. But there is also another form of warfare which we have probably last seen in 1982 in the siege of Beirut. And siege warfare is obviously a very ancient form of war, perhaps honed here in the land of Israel in biblical times. And when you are laying siege to a capital city, such as Beirut, obviously you do it in order for the military there or for the terrorists to give up. But you are also damaging the population and perhaps even fatally. How do you reconcile the values and the tactics involved in siege warfare?
That's a very good question, but allow me to observation before I answer your question. The first one relating to what was mentioned here before. You know, we are here in Israel, and we are looking on the interests of Israel. And I see a big opportunity for us during this time. And this is the Israeli high-tech, the Israeli capabilities, the Israeli contribution to the world, because we can really do it. I know that Prime Minister Bennett was trying to push it.
When you say contribution, you don't mean that it's free. Contribution only...
Contribution could be in all kinds of ways, but Israel can contribute to those issues of sustainability, issues of environment. Our technology and our high-tech could really contribute the world on those areas, and I think that this is the opportunity really for us to contribute the world. Of course, it is also interest of Israeli industry and so on, but I think that this is something...
So this is one evasion of my question. Let's take the second one before you get to the answer.
And then I have to remember what was the question. And
I'll remind you.
And the second one is really what we could see here, and this is, I think, quite an effect of what happened in Ukraine, is that the countries are now looking what is happening with us. Collaboration, global, part of a union, it's okay. But everyone really is now looking inside and see how can I defend myself, what I'm going to do during crisis time, and so on. We see it obviously in the military arena. We just heard about the deal that was cut between Israel and Germany, a huge deal of $4.3 billion for the aero system defending Germany. So this is really understanding of countries in Europe about that. Going back to your question. And it's also, related to what I was talking before. It is not today, in the military, the new military affair, when we're talking about siege and those things, I would look at it from two different angles. The first one is the ethic, moral one, and I can tell you that for sure, this is always a discussion which is being held inside the military, for sure in the Air Force, is to make sure that we are dealing with the bad guys and we are not really affecting as much as we can. We are looking on the collateral damage. We see that we are not affecting the community or the public or the population, which is in a city. It could be any other place in the world. Gaza is a good example. I don't think that we even think anymore on those terms of siege on Beirut. And technology is also kicking in here. AI technologies that we have today, cyber technologies that we have today. We could be much more precise on what are we doing within the cities to our enemies and affecting as less as we can the population there. So the idea, I don't think that we are anymore talking about military, strategy of siege on cities, but to see how could we be very precise on damaging our enemies, and technology is a huge player on this.
Eran, this ties in to the broader climate change questions. We have seen, for instance, a few years ago, when there were global agreements on emissions, that rich countries have paid poorer countries in order to trade and rather than lessen their emissions so that the world will not heat up so much so quickly. It didn't really change, only money changed hands. And obviously, not only do countries have their needs industrially, but also politicians who run the countries care about their domestic audiences, and they do not want the voters to get mad at them. Is there any way around it?
Well, the conundrum is as follows. Democracy rewards short-termism. And it's a system of government that incentivizes politicians of all kinds to ignore the long term in favor of the short term. And that's the way they all, almost without any exception, operate. And the systems under them, the various executive branches in each and every country, follow suit. I can attest, from my personal experience, when I was head of policy planning in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, one of our roles was long-term planning. And we tried to bring to the attention of the decision makers, the foreign minister, the national security cabinet, issues of long-term, including the environmental issues. It was in 2008, and we brought a number of experts from abroad, and we tried to create a discussion about the various linkages between climate change and Israel's national security. And we wrote several documents that were pretty good, if I can attest to the quality of my own merchandise. But of course, it was virtually impossible to get the attention of any decision maker. And I was at the time in close contact with my counterparts around the world, in Washington, in London, in Beijing, everywhere. And at least in all democracies, they were all in the same situation.
But is it a matter of attention span or of interests which come down to what you call
one derives from the other.
Where the long term is next week.
Political calculation for any politician, prime minister, minister, member of parliament, whatever, is, of course, getting re-elected. The next political cycle and the historical cycle and the climate cycle simply does not correlate to the cycle that is relevant to them. I would add, unfortunately, that the non-democratic regimes, and China is a prominent example, are actually much better at that. They plan for the long term because they know, or at least they plan to stay, for the duration of their time lives, and they plan. They're very good at long-term planning, there's a lot to say about China, about its policies. Some of them really horrifying and so on. But when it comes to long-term planning, they're very good. And also when it comes to dealing with climate change, they're, I think, among the more, shall we say, sophisticated regimes in the world. We may not like everything that they're doing, and they do have kind of old grievances that they waive all the time, justifiably so from their perspective, because the West, the US, and the others are trying to kind of remedy their own sins at the expense of China. That's true. Nevertheless, when you look at the hard figures, the hard numbers, the numbers of trees planted, Beijing far exceeds any other capital in the world. When you look at solar power and production of parts for the solar industry, Beijing China generally has accelerated tremendously and had a good influence on the global industry, and so on and so forth. So, back to your question, I think we need to figure out mechanisms, and I think that the answer here does not lie with the politicians. It lies with public opinion and public pressure on politicians to kind of take them out of the short-termism trap and start dealing seriously with the long-term issues. And again, unfortunately, climate change is no longer even a long-term issue. It's an immediate issue. We see it in fires in Canada, and we see it everywhere, floods and so on. So it's here, and I think now probably in the next political cycles there will be, politicians will absolutely have to give more attention to this issue. I hope it's not too late.
Reuven, you flew helicopters for many years, and while Robert Zimmerman, also known as Bob Dylan, wrote that you don't need a weatherman, obviously, if your own expert on meteorology didn't warn you, you could have headed into turbulence, mist, fog, who knows what. And the weather is turning more and more unpredictable. Does it have a lot of impact on military operations? We know, of course, that D-Day was moved from June 5th to June 6th, and also the Israeli raid on the North Korean-built Syrian nuclear reactor had to be timed according to the weather. There are many examples. But from your own position in the day room, in the squadron room,
Okay.
Does it have a lot of impact on the military?
I would have to say no. The reason is, and if you'd asked me 30 years ago, I would say absolutely. Even though the changes we see now are on a scale of 2%, 3%, in temperatures. Look what we're talking about temperature. It could be significant for the world, but for military operations, no. But I'm going to strongly say no because of where technology is going. In the past, I needed to see something. Okay, so if there's a disruption, I can't see it. Now technology enables me to penetrate anything. Second thing, we used to need pilots. Humanity for about 100 years needed human beings to pilot these things in the sky, and we would all say, wow, those pilots are so amazing, we need to give them leather jackets. We don't need pilots anymore. Soon we won't have any pilots. So that means we're going to have drones and robots that will do the work for us. And they can fly through anything. And by the way, if 10% of them fall down for some reason, who cares? And they're also getting cheaper. So I'm saying we could go on and on. I would say in general, for military applications, this is irrelevant. Certainly there are things like I flew once to put out fires in Greece. Israel also these days helps Greece a lot in this field.
More symbolism than substance.
Well, for the people that are there, it's not symbolic. One of the most craziest things I ever did, and a few days of really almost sacrificing to help them. So here you have, a lot of efforts that are put in, and we're going to, if we see more fires, we'll see more aerial platforms. It's semi-military. In Israel, it is military. So, of course, we could see that we need to divert attention to certain fields. But in general, to your question, no.
It's very generous for a pilot to say that pilots are soon going to be redundant. But are you as skeptical as Reuven was regarding the necessity of human beings in the cockpit when you are flying commercial to the United States? Would you give your entire existence to the care of an autopilot from the word go?
This is a great question. I'm not sure that I would be on the first flight. But maybe on the 100th flight, maybe yes. And at the end of the day, the world is going there. And Reuven is right, although I'm not sure that if the Air Force commander would sit here, he would say the same. Because
there would be no Air Force commander.
Air Force commanders worldwide would explain you why the human factor would be still there. And when we see the movies, the future movies, Star Wars and so on, the pilots are still there. So it would go there. I mean, there is no question. By the way, I had the privilege to serve in Paris for a few years on behalf of the Israeli Ministry of Defense. And some of the metros there, it's without human beings driving them. And you don't ask even yourself, is it without a driver or with a driver? So I think it is really a matter of time. We are probably going there. AI is again kicking in. This is the next, we have to, of course, we have to look at it very carefully, we have to regulate it and so on, but this is the trend, and it's going there, that's for sure.
Danny, most nations at least started fighting over territory. Later, it's also religion, ideology, and vengeance if the conflicts are very long drawn, and the one wants to take revenge for the previous conflict. But climate change, floods, desertification, they all change territories. So perhaps we are not only fighting the previous war, we are fighting a previous territory. For instance, one of the most bitter disputes between Israel and Syria is where is the line going to be drawn if there is peace. And the traditional Syrian position is that it has to be at most 10 meters, 10 yards from the shore of the Sea of Galilee. But it's no longer there. The terrain moved. How do you diplomats deal with such changes?
Well, I think what we see in this modern world with all these epic changes is that, yeah, territory matters less. Although it is very important still, it's still the basis. And we go back to human nature. Human nature is that you need a territory.
Even though the first human move was to vacate the territory, the Garden of Eden.
Absolutely, absolutely. But they did it not on their own accord. They were punished by to do that. In any case, I think that the climate change and the real threats for our planet, our food security, water availability, affordable energy, all these things are quite palpable now, and they're going to be even worse. If this is existential threat, and I compare it or equate it to the nuclear threat. With the nuclear threat, the common thinking was that it was the end of wars. Why? Because of the mutually assured destruction. This will deter. Everything will be quiet. This wasn't the case. There were more wars since World War II until now than in the previous 100 years. The same thing is with this climate change, because I would say reason would dictate that everybody will cooperate because we are all here in the same boat. But this is not the case. And this is why I believe we are moving into an era of more mercantilism, of more patriotism, where countries will have to rely on themselves. Mm-hmm. And what is the real answer is technology.
Your background shows, because you started out as a trade attaché.
That's right. And technology is the future. I can tell you that with technology, you can grow, grains or anything else on any kind of terrain, any kind of season. And I think it's going to go there, where each country will be autocratic or will look to be self-sufficient.
The only
and even food. I mean, exactly. Meat or whatever. I mean,
exactly.
I fully agree. Technology.
The only irreplaceable human phenomenon is such a panel with human anchors. Now, Eran, Danny said that we are all in the same boat, but tragically enough, some of these boats capsize, and that has to do with migration. Climate change, floods, deserts, they push especially the have-nots out of their countries and into the richer shores. Can the world really establish a global policy regarding migration, or is it inevitable that people would like to keep what they have and not share it with newcomers?
I'm not going to be very optimistic here. I think we already have more than a glimpse of how the future is going to look like. You alluded to it with those capsizing boats between North Africa and Europe. And I think, barring any huge transformation, this kind of black swan that we cannot imagine, which I agree will come from technology. For example, cold fusion. If and when we have cold fusion and energy cost is going to be zero, this will have a tremendous effect that is difficult to forecast, and it will have an overarching effect on everything, including the issue of refugees and their prospects and so on. But barring something like that, we will continue to see an acceleration of what we're already seeing. There are territories and countries that are becoming increasingly unlivable. And as we speak, thousands of migrants are being forced by climate to vacate their premises and move north or west. And it's happening in Africa. It will happen in the Middle East as well. It will happen even in the Gulf. That right now, those countries are able, mostly, the richer Gulf countries, are able to deal with it, pouring immense amounts of money. But at some point, that is obviously not going to be sustainable. So we will see more and more migration, as you say, of the have-nots towards the northern and richer areas of the planet. And inevitably, those countries that are the target countries for refugees will not be able to absorb all of them. The numbers don't add up. And what it brings to mind is horrible scenes that some of which we're already seeing in our reality, and some of them we saw and are seeing in sci-fi movies of those colonies of rich, secluded countries and territories that are defending themselves against the poorer migrants that are trying desperately to come in. And I think that's the wave of the future, again, barring any dramatic advances in terms of technology.
Some of these countries do need working hands for the jobs that the
yes, but the numbers don't add up.
And the two problems are that once they stay there, they want to vote to have equal rights, and the other problem is that you have empty spaces there which Daesh and others want to fill, and this is all the time that we have. Time is also a very precious resource. Reuven Ben Shalom, Doron Gavish, Danny Ayalon, Eran Etzion, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We will be back next month with another edition of Powers in Play. Shalom from Jerusalem.